Well, on this 9/11 anniversary, I'm joined tonight by Christopher Kolenda, an Afghanistan war veteran who also advised both the Obama and Trump administrations on Afghanistan. He is credited with being one of two people who opened communications that led to peace talks with the Taliban. He is currently an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security, and he joins me tonight from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Mr. Kolenda, welcome to the day. I want to ask you, how do you read what the U.S. president said today at the Pentagon about the Taliban? Did he conflate the Taliban with al-Qaeda?
Well, it certainly seems that he did. And I want to begin by just, my heart goes out to all the people who have been affected by 9/11, both the event itself 18 years ago, as well as the aftermath. To endless wars, as President Trump calls them, to include all those veterans from Afghanistan. I was talking with a person yesterday who was with Deutsche Bank on September 11, 2001, in Manhattan, right across the street from 9/11 and from the towers. And she, described for me the events of that day. And it's just absolutely searing. It's important, as you know, that there's a difference between the Taliban and al-Qaeda. Negotiations with al-Qaeda not possible. Negotiations with the Taliban are possible, but as we've seen, very, very difficult.
You have invested a lot of time in getting talks with the Taliban up and running, and you did that under both Presidents Obama and President Trump. I'd like to hear your thoughts on the U.S. president inviting the Taliban to Camp David. I mean, did you know that Trump had extended that invitation?
No, and look, I'm not a U.S. official any longer. The work that I did in 2017, 2018 to try to help get this current round of talks going was as a private citizen, not as a U.S. government official. So, I mean, it does seem a bit odd. To put it lightly, to invite the Taliban to Camp David premature. Maybe after a lot of confidence is built, after a ceasefire, after have been extensive negotiations in Afghanistan and a changed environment, to include the Taliban renouncing their ties to al-Qaeda and announcing very clearly that al-Qaeda or any other terrorist organization is unwelcome in Afghanistan. And they've made similar declarations on human rights and followed through with those things, making credible commitments and keeping them. Then maybe you have a situation in which the peace process has advanced to the state, in which you'd have some sort of meeting on U.S. soil. But it's really premature, and quite frankly, is the reaction from both sides of the political spectrum in the United States has been radioactive.
Well, what did you think when Trump declared those talks to be dead? Are they really dead?
Well, the door is closed, but it's not locked. At the end of the day, you've got a situation in which you've got a strategic stalemate. As long as the Afghan government maintains international support, the Taliban are not going to be able to overthrow the government. Mm-hmm. Conversely, as long as the Taliban maintains external sanctuary and sufficient internal support, indigenous support in Afghanistan, it is not going to be decisively defeated. And so we are in that situation on 2 weeks ago, and we're still in that situation today. It's unlikely to change. So, really, you've got two options for ways forward. One is you can try to keep U.S. and NATO troops indefinitely in a landlocked country that's surrounded by hostile powers, and have, and with an Afghan government that's having a very difficult time right now dismantling the kleptocracy that's been undermining its legitimacy in the eyes of Afghans. Or you can pursue a peace process. But we likely need to take a different approach in a peace process in the future. This time we went for the big deal, and I'm sure there are a lot of reasons going for the big deal. We elected not to use a more deliberate step-by-step approach to build confidence, which historically has a much better track record. So my advice would be that if we're going, once talks resume, and they should, we need to take a very different approach. Both the United States, the Taliban, and the Afghan government need to take a very different approach to this and move in a more step-by-step incremental process that builds confidence, builds some trust in the talks over time. And then I think you have the potential to see some very significant outcomes.
I'd like to play a clip for you, Mr. Kolenda. It's from July of this year, and it's the U.S. president saying what he could do to Afghanistan if he really wanted to. Take a listen.
I have plans on Afghanistan that if I wanted to win that war, Afghanistan would be wiped off the face of the earth. It would be gone. It would be over literally in 10 days.
Now, when you hear the president saying that, Mr. Kolenda, can you imagine these peace talks being revived as long as President Trump is president?
Well, it's going to take some strategic leadership on all sides of this conflict to resume these talks. I think it's going to take a much more sensible approach to these talks. I mean, clearly just getting a bunch of people around a room in secret in Doha and trying to hash out some sort of deal is not going to work. And this deal could have been potentially destabilizing. So you're invariably in a situation where you either resume peace talks and try to gain a successful outcome from this war through peace. And quite frankly, from the United States and NATO perspective, if Afghanistan's no longer a platform for international terrorism, and ideally if Afghanistan is a place where the rights of all Afghans, men, women, and children included, are respected, then that's quite frankly a successful outcome for the United States and NATO. For the Taliban, a successful outcome to them is no more international combat troop presence. So that's entirely possible as well. So you've got a situation where the objectives of one another, in this case, U.S., NATO on the one side, Taliban on the other side, there's no disagreement in terms of the outcome. But there's disagreement in terms of how you get there. Now, the Afghan governments, of course, are in a different situation.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, how do you reconcile those two? The Afghan government wants to respect women's rights, for example, and we know that the Taliban, they're not known for doing that at all. So are they going to change a fundament of their thinking, or can these two opposing ideas be expected to live in peace, to coexist in Afghanistan peacefully?
Right. Well, when you look at actual behaviors, you see a much more mixed picture than what you've presented, of course, on the ground in Afghanistan. And this is exactly why a confidence-building approach is important, that all sides, the U.S. and NATO, the Afghan government, and the Taliban need to demonstrate that they can make and maintain credible commitments that lead step by step towards reductions in violence and ultimately talks towards a political settlement in Afghanistan.
Let me ask you about former National Security Advisor John Bolton. He is now out of the picture. We know that he was opposed to the president inviting the Taliban to Camp David, but he was no friend to peace talks, at least publicly. Did you feel that you were in a battle against John Bolton when you were working to set up and to make these talks work?
Well, Bolton was not the national security advisor at that time. It was an uphill battle. Look, there's a lot of impressions about the Taliban. Some are accurate, some are not accurate. In terms of whether they are willing to engage in a peace process. And part of our effort was to try to identify that and have the Taliban do things that would suggest that they were willing to talk, such as their February 14th letter to the American people asking for talks. And then a big breakthrough came when President Ghani and General Nicholson announced a ceasefire over Eid al-Fitr in June of 2017. They invited the Taliban to do the same. The Taliban said they would do a 3-day ceasefire. And And they made that announcement, and for 3 days over the Eid holiday, there was no violence in Afghanistan. At least, no Taliban on Afghan government violence, and it really opened people's eyes that the Taliban had much greater sense of command and control than many of the skeptics gave them credit for, and so that was a key data point in convincing the Trump administration to at least try a peace process. And as I said, I think the door is closed right now, but the strategic situation is unlikely to change in the near future or over the midterm. And so, fortunately, the door is not locked, and I think you'll see a resumption of talks here at some point, and hopefully they'll take a different trajectory than this one.
Christopher Kolenda joining us tonight from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Mr. Kolenda, we appreciate your valuable insights on the situation with the United States and Afghanistan and the Taliban. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Brent.